So I know we talked about a population versus a sample, right? Last time? Remind us real quick, what's the difference?
Population is all.
Population is everybody. Sample is
a small
a subset of the population, okay? Census is a what? It's a data collection method that samples the entire population. Good. A census is a type of data collection. And that's really what this unit is. We're going to call it as data collection because we're going to start with surveys and then we're going to move on to experiments. Both methods are data collection methods. And so our test will cover chapters 11, 12, and 13. Okay? 11 being simulations, 12 being surveys, and 13 being experimental design. So the first type of data collection method that we know is a census, okay? And we have a different, kind of take a step back for just a second. We have something called observational studies. Did you guys read about those last night in chapter 11, hopefully? Yes, no? You need to know what it is. So it's one of the vocabulary words. What is an observational study? And then we have something called a retrospective study. All of these words you should have known. So retrospective study, and then there was a prospective study. Any idea? Yeah. Not the purpose actually, it's how it's collected, believe it or not. An observational study is just that. You're just observing something, okay? It's a study where you're observing something. I don't know what it could be, anything really, okay? It's a study, not a survey necessarily. Well, survey methods can be part of studies. But an observational study or an experiment is really kind of the other thing. So surveys maybe are part of an observational study. It is a way to collect the data. But both of these are observational studies. They are the two types. Okay? A retrospective study, any kind of guess looking at, if you're going to decode the word retrospective, what do you think it means? Has to do with time. Looking back at something that's already existed. Okay? So for example, if you wanted to study something about the World Series, okay, you could retrospectively go back in time and look at how many times the Giants kicked the Royals' butts, right? I mean, who knows? Or how many times the pitcher purposely hit the player. I don't know, Not saying anything bad, but, that was rude. Did anyone watch a game last night? Am I the only loser that watched baseball? What happened? The pitcher purposely hit, the Giants pitcher purposely hit the Kansas City catcher in the leg. Hit pitched at him. And he could barely walk first base, so they were trying to get him out of the game. Not his fault. Anyway, all right. Anyway, okay. So retrospective is going back in time, right, and looking at something that's already existed. What do you think a prospective study would be? Okay. So a prospective study oftentimes are medical studies where you take a group of people and you follow them for a group of time. Breast cancer or any kind of cancer is really a prospective study often because like my mom, for example, had a melanoma, which is a really aggressive type of skin cancer, about 10 years ago. And she was part of a prospective study that followed her for 10 years because they were trying to decide what is the likelihood of a melanoma returning as another form of cancer. And lucky for her, nothing ever reappeared, but I think it's only like 10% of the population it doesn't ever reappear. Like you get a 90% chance or something like that of it coming back as a different form of cancer, like lung cancer or liver cancer or something else like that. So lucky for my mom, but she was part of this study that followed her for a period of time, which is interesting. Okay? So two different kinds of study that deal with the time frame. Okay? Observational studies are really what we're going to talk about today. There are various ways to collect that data, surveys being one of them, and that's really where we're going to focus. Census is a type of observational study as well. It is a census of it's a survey or a study of the entire population, which we already said. So We already talked last class, and we're going to focus more on bias here in a few minutes, but that is something that definitely goes wrong. Do you remember without looking up here, what's the best way to not introduce bias? Randomization. Very good. So we really want to randomize as much as possible. So that's like the #1 key. Okay. And then the other thing with sample size, right? You have to be large enough, but randomization really is key. So we talked. I think I gave you the symbols last time for all of these, correct?
Yeah.
So look at your notes last time you missed it. And we talked about what an SRS was. Okay. The SRS is like the gold standard of sampling. It's what you want to do every time. It's probably not feasible or possible to do it every time. Give me an example of an SRS, like in real life. Give me an example of what would be that kind of a sampling method. We do one every day.
The chart over there?
Okay, what about the chart over there? Picking the 5 is not an SRS. We picked
Individual one?
We picked one, right? And we put one out and mix it and put it back. Or if we pick the 5 and we put it back before the next person, then it would be an SRS, wouldn't it? Okay. So we have to make sure we put it back before the next person and mix it up. Every possible sample of whatever size we choose has an equal chance to be selected. Each individual has an equal chance of being selected. And one of the interesting things, I forget if this book talks about it in this chapter or not. Did he talk about the Vietnam War at all when you read it? No? You all didn't read it, did you? It is chapter 12. Was it chapter 12?
It's 11
Okay.
and 12.
Okay. Anyway, I'm not sure if it's in the book or not, but one of the things that came up back in the 60s with the Vietnam War and the draft was back in that time, they would, I guess you would have to have your draft card and your draft number, right? And so they would literally have these huge bins with numbers in them, and they would kick the numbers out, okay? What's the problem if, let's say that, you're at, let's say the city of Manassas, and you have this post office gave me their numbers, this post office gave me their numbers, and oh, here's Miss Macker from her post office, she's late, she went and dumped her numbers in, and then they just went in and picked one, and guess what? Every single time they picked one from Mrs. Macker's post office. Why? Because I was on top. I was late to the game, right? And so what did they have? So that was not an SRS, because every person did not have an equal chance of getting drafted. If you were in Mrs. Macker's territory, sorry, see you later, you're off. What did they have to do to fix it? What could have been a solution to fix the problem? Shuffle them up. Okay? That's why I have to mix the sticks every time when I come in, or when you guys come in. So what they ended up doing with these large drums is they put them on a
Handle and axis.
an axis. They did have the lottery too, but they didn't until for a while, right? So they have to mix up the numbers, mix up the names. Just because Mrs. Macker's late to the game delivering her name doesn't mean that everybody shouldn't have a likely chance to go to war, right? So that was something that actually is a real life example of why an SRS is important, okay? Why you want to make sure that you are really mixing it up. The most basic type of SRS is when you throw everybody's name into a hat and then you mix them up, okay? That is the most basic type. Okay. So that's the most basic type. You may also, so we'll write these examples of SRSs down, okay? So put all the names into a hat, or put all of whatever you're selecting into a hat, or into a big bin, mix them up, and draw. That is kind of like the most basic type of SRS. Let's take it a little step further. Let's look at an example. Let's say at Stonewall Jackson High School, we want to talk to the graduating class. I know that I don't have time to sample every person in the graduating class, but I want to get a representative sample. I want to get a fair sample. So how could I create, or what would I do, besides taking all 700 names and cutting them out and putting them into a hat and that would take too much time. What could I do if I wanted to randomize the selection process? Okay, that is not that. Okay, so he said choose every technique. It's called a systematic sample when you do that, which is fine, and that's okay to do. We'll talk about what you have to do before that, though. There's another way to get an SRS. Did they talk about it? Have you assigned numbers to people or anything in the book? No. Okay. So the other example would be, all right, what if, how many are in your class? In your class?
489.
489, okay? So let's say there are 489 seniors. So what I could do is I could get a list of names from guidance, alphabetized or whatever, it doesn't have to be, I don't care, and I assign a number 1 to 489 each person. Then what could I take my glorious little device called a TI-84 class, and what could I do to pick people at random? Random integer function. That means every person has an equally likely chance of being selected. Okay, I don't know what number is going to come up here, right? And you can just do rand int 1 to 489. And it would give us a random number, and we would go and talk to whoever number that was assigned to. That is an SRS. Okay? So how would I describe that as a scenario here? Assign numbers to each person and use a random function to select people. Okay, so that would be an example of an SRS as well. As long as every person has an equally likely chance of being selected, we're good. Those are the two most common. Okay? Other sampling designs, okay? So we have systematic samples. Let's go with what Charles was suggesting. Okay? What is a systematic sample? Well, he said select every 10th person on the list. I'm cool with that. The problem is if every person doesn't have an equally likely chance of being selected. If I'm the first person in the graduating class, I'm not getting picked. If I'm the first, like alphabetized, right? Doesn't matter. So what could I do? Still picking the 10th person, what can I do at the beginning to make it more random? Okay, I could somehow shuffle the names. How would I do that? I'm just saying, like, I don't know, type them in. I'm just thinking of an easy way. If I just had a list, guidance gave me an alphabetized list. It's in my hands. I don't want to have to retype anything. I don't want to have to cut anything up and put them in a hat. What's the easiest way, quickly, to make it random?
Do the same thing as we did before, except every 10th person, every 10th result.
That's what I wanted to say. No, sorry. Yeah, if you randomize your starting point, and I just do that one time, 1 to 489, and let's say I get picked, I don't know, let's see what it's going to give me, okay? What is my random integer to 1 to 489 going to give me? Let's just look. I can't see it. All right, so 109, and I don't know who the 109th person is, but from there on out, I'm going to pick every 10th person. Okay? So I've randomized my starting point and moved on. Randomizing the starting point is key here. Okay? So we'll have to make sure that we write that. Let me write that. So you need to know what kind of a sampling method this is. Okay? Stratified random sampling. Okay? You guys should know what that is as well. What is a stratified random sample?
You take a random sample from a group, or like multiple groups of like strata, like groups of things.
So what we want to do in the beginning is identify what subgroups in our population we're interested in. Okay? So we could do it, like we were talking about all students at Stonewall Jackson High School. We could talk about freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. And we could randomly pick so many freshmen, so many sophomores, so many juniors, so many seniors. That is a classic example of stratified random sampling. Okay? What if I was just talking about the senior class? Well, how could I break it into, what would I be concerned about with just the senior class? Males and females. I could break the strata into that. Make sure I ask so many males and so many females. What if I was concerned about GPA and like your rank or something like that? How could I stratify that? I could make sure that I talked to the 90th percentile people, the 80th percentile people, that kind of thing, okay? But that's not really knowing who they are. You know what I mean? Like, when you break into when you break up into a strata, meaning that's the subgroup, okay? They all have to be alike in some special way. So, like, all freshmen are the same age, all sophomores are the same age. So it needs to be something about their genome. Advanced diploma versus regular diploma. I like that suggestion. What about an IB student versus a non-IB student? Is that something that you can break it down into? Sure. Okay. So if stratified random sampling is good if you want to ensure that you're getting some from each group. Why is an SRS does not guarantee that? Is it possible, if I wanted to select 20 students at random, that all 20 students would be from the senior class? Is that possible? Sure. Okay. Is it very likely? Probably not, but it's definitely possible. So if I want to guarantee and ensure that I have a representative sample, stratified random sampling sometimes is the way to go. Okay? Now, what about a cluster sample? Not a cluster anything else. It's a cluster sample. Okay? So let me get your heads out the gun. Cluster sample. What is it? Lane's got a book out. I'm gonna read the definition. Hey, it's a good place to start. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
It's kind of like a stratified random sample, except the strata are random.
Not exactly. Exactly.
They all have equal parts of them.
Okay. Say it again.
They all have equal parts of each, like how the strata is like the equal amount of the different subgroups.
Well, a strata doesn't have to be equal amounts. Okay. If you think about males and females, like my daughter's 5th grade class has, like I think her whole 5th grade class in all of her elementary school, I think it's 30% female. Okay, so it definitely doesn't have to be. You're just trying to ensure you have different groups. But you kind of were leaning towards something I was hoping for. Yes, go ahead. It's an entire group. Now, in a cluster sample, you are taking one thing, and within that thing will have lots of strata inside of it. A stratified sample, you have a sample that has, you're picking from each strata. So you're randomizing within each strata, whereas a cluster sample, you're randomizing the thing that has the stratas in it. A little bit different. Okay? Let me give you an example. So I think that's the easiest way to hit it. Okay? If I wanted to do a stratified random sample for students in Prince William County, okay? And I wanted to make sure, let's say high school students in Prince William County, okay? A stratified random sample. I would get all the names, and let's say I wanted to do it by, my strata is going to be 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th graders. I would get all of the names of all the high school students in all of the county, and I would randomly pick so many 9th graders, so many 10th graders, so many 11th graders, so many 12th graders. That is a stratified random sample. A cluster sample would be, I'm going to pick Stonewall Jackson High School. Because that is a cluster or a group of students that have all of the strata identified inside of it. Does that make it a little bit clearer if I say it that way? Okay, so a stratified random sample, you are identifying the strata, and then you are picking from a few from within. A cluster sample is when I just pick one group that happens to have all the strata there. Okay? A little bit different. All right, multi-stage sampling. Right. That just means that it has more than one part to it. Okay? Maybe we pick a cluster sample, and then within the cluster sample, we go from there and pick a different subgroup. Okay? It just means it has more than one phase. Nothing really more than that. Okay? So what I'd like us to do is be able to identify what type of sampling is going on. So I have the book here. So my book is falling apart. On page 290, you can borrow a book. There's enough for at least one per table. I want you to look at problems 11 and 12. And 11 and 12 talk about identifying the kind of sampling that's going on. Keep it out, because then we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to talk about what biases are involved. For each one right now, I believe it's just ABC. Is there a B? Okay, so it's ABCD. So for each one, you're going to have two blanks. Okay? You're going to tell me the kind of sampling that's involved, which means, is it a systematic sample? Is it a cluster sample? Is it an SRS? What's happening? So you're going to tell me the kind of sampling method, and then you're going to leave a blank because we haven't talked about bias yet, but we're going to talk in a few minutes about what kind of bias is introduced. So first, just identify the type of sampling method for each, okay? Narrow it down. So in number 11, okay, when we talk about part A, you put ad in the newspaper. Okay? What kind of sampling would that be? I mean, we didn't talk about a convenience sample, did we? We should probably add that to our list. So let's do that. Okay? A convenience sample is a source of bias, actually, but it's a type of sampling. So let's add it to our sampling method. So convenient, and I always spell convenience wrong. Is it EN?
You put the dot for the I wrong.
I know it's wrong. So there's that.
Put the dot in the I for
Oh, it's really criticizing where it's at. Okay. You got it, yeah. Anyway, a convenient sample, guys. And Hunter, you want to explain what that is, just out of curiosity? Or you don't want to? You can read the definition, that's fine. Okay. So we typically call that like the man on the street sample. Like, you ever see somebody like on a TV show or something? I don't know. And they are sitting on the side of a news reporter is perfect for this, right? And they'll be like, I'm standing outside of Civil Jackson High School, and I'm going to ask, what do you think about blah, blah, blah? Whoever happens to be right there walking past them and ask that question, right? That is a convenience sample. That one person might even notice Civil Jackson High School. Who knows, right? So, convenience sample. Lots of bias introduced in that. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But I don't think putting an ad as a convenience sample, not so much. It doesn't really say what kind of sampling it is. It's more like just kind of a. It's something more of a bias than it is a sampling method. We're not sampling in this particular case. So I can see why that one would be an issue. What you're asking for is a response per population based on the ad, so that's going to just be suffering from bias. So it's not really a sampling method. It's more of a, I agree with Hunter that it's a convenient way to do it, right? So, but you're not really collecting the data because you're just putting the information out there for them and expecting them to respond. Okay? So the way it's being collected is called, it's going to suffer from something called voluntary response bias. We'll talk about what that is in a few minutes. Okay? So let's leave the sampling method kind of blank on that one because it really isn't one because you're asking them to respond to you. Okay? Bias, which definitely has that. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, let's talk about B. Randomly select one of the elementary schools and contact every parent by phone. We know what that is. What is it? A cluster. Okay? Picking one group of everything and sampling everybody there. Okay, so that's definitely a cluster sample. How about C, send a survey home with every student and ask parents to fill it out and return the next day. If you're saying one to every student, what is that? That's a census. And we should say it's actually an attempt at a census. It's not a true census unless everybody returns it, right? So it's going to have some bias attached to it. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Okay? Or what's the difference between non-responsive and voluntary response? We'll get to that in 2 minutes. All right, and then part D, let's see what D said. Randomly select 20 parents from each elementary school, send them with a survey, and then follow up with a phone call. What's that? That's stratified. Very good. You're picking so many from each of the elementary schools. That's stratified. If you're picking one elementary school and simply everybody there, that's stratified. Okay. Let's look at number 12. Go back to the, again, we'll come back to the types of bias in a minute. Okay, 12A. Run a poll on the local TV news. Okay, that's the same issue as the ad, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really isn't a sampling method as much as it is something that suffers from bias. We'll kind of do A blend in terms of sampling method, but we will talk about bias in a minute. Part B, hold a PTA meeting at each of the 12 elementary schools and tally the opinions expressed by those who attend the meetings. Okay? What do you think about that one? Well, you're picking, be careful, yes, you're picking each of the elementary schools, right? But you're not picking 20 from each. You're just holding a meeting and seeing who comes, right? Sorry. So it is, in a way, you're breaking it up by strata, and you're going and talking to each of the strata groups, so I agree. It's not random who comes, though, right? So there's definitely some bias there. We'll talk about that. But it's an attempt at a stratified sample. Wouldn't you agree? So we'll say attempt stratified sample. Because we are attempting to talk to each of the strata. All right, part C, randomly select one class at each elementary school and contact each of those parents. Okay? What do you think about that? It's actually a multi-stage sample. Why is it multi-stage? Because you're first doing what? You're picking a school. Then you are picking a class. Right? So it's kind of like a two-stepper. Agree? Okay? If there's more than one method going on, you call it multi-stage. Right? And then let's look at D. And yeah, there's definitely going to be some bias with it. All of these have bias. Let's talk about D. D. Go through the district's enrollment record, selecting every 40th parent. We should hopefully be randomizing the starting point, however. PTA volunteers will go to those homes to interview. What's that? Systematic. That's kind of the easiest one to pick, don't you think? Notice none of these were SRSs. What could be an example of how we could use, what would be an SRS method?
Getting all the kids.
Getting everybody who goes to the enrollment records, right, in the county, then randomly picking one. Putting it in a hat, or you could just number them and randomly pick somebody. Right? No SRSs interested. No. Right, so keep this out because we're going to come back to it and talk about bias. And we'll identify each of the biases involved. So let's talk about what all the biases are. You should have read about some of these. Some of you are using the words, and we'll figure out what they mean. Voluntary response bias. Somebody who knows, or you can look at the definition, give me an example of something that suffers from voluntary response bias. What would it be? We're looking at the definition. It says individuals can choose on their own whether to participate in the sample. When I'm eating dinner with my family and they're calling me and I hang up on you guys because I don't want to listen to you, right? Another one. Right. Okay. So you're choosing not to do that. Yes. then there's the old comment cards sitting at the table. Great. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? What kind of survey result, what kind of bias would those results have? Right. That's kind of like the things like rate my teacher. You know, you've all done that, right? That's why we don't pay attention to that. Because people who are mad at their teacher go online and say terrible things, right? That's why a lot of times those poor service, rate my service cards, only the people that are angry or people with very, very loud opinions, whether good or bad, are going to respond to those kinds of things. Okay? Because that's a type of bias as well. The voluntary response bias. You can choose to answer or not. Choose to respond or not. I can hang up on you if you call my house. I can choose to attend a PTA meeting or not. Okay? Convenient sampling, okay, is a sampling method that is hugely biased in and of itself, which is why we kind of listed it underneath the bias sample, underneath the bias part. Okay? It's just non-representative. The whole idea of a sample is to make sure that the people that you're asking or the sample is representative of the population. A convenient sample will almost, I shouldn't say it will never be, it will almost never be representative. It's just going to be whoever happens to be there. Yes, it will suffer from undercoverage because of that. Okay? And what is undercoverage? When you don't have every subset population represented. So it suffers from undercoverage, right? Undercoverage is a type of bias that we want to be very good. Okay? Good. So, how about the difference between non-response bias and response bias? And voluntary response bias. Wow, what is that? Non-response bias? You know what voluntary response bias is. What is it again? We're on the same page, but they all sound alike. You're going to confuse all the time. Voluntary response is, I choose not to respond to your survey. I hang up the phone. Click. Or I choose to, right? You choose whether or not to participate. Good. Question. Does that mean if we have it does. There's a difference between all three. So we're going to talk about this. Okay? Non-response bias is when an entire group doesn't respond to a survey. Not an individual, but an entire group. An entire group is not represented in the survey. We kind of alluded to this with the U.S. Census last class, didn't we? We said that the U.S. Census is not a true census because who's not represented? Illegal immigrants. Who else? Homeless, right? So those would be the U.S. Census suffers from non-response bias because there are whole groups that don't respond to it. Okay? That is what non-response bias is. Not I choose to hang up on you, but a whole group isn't represented. Okay? Response bias is something different. Response bias comes in two forms. Your question first? On non-response? How would voting be? Yes.
People
felons are a
Mental disability,
right. So yes,
people under 18.
right. So I agree with you. Voting is a great example of whole groups that aren't able to respond to that survey. Yes, people under 18, felons, those types. Yes, I agree. They're not represented in these things. Good example. Now, response bias. Different than voluntary response, different than non-response. Response bias is when the person asking the question tries to influence your answer. Okay? So, for example, you can vote for president. You can vote, huh? You can do it. You vote for this person. Are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? You should do it. You should vote for my person. You should do mine. Okay? 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 That is response bias. Okay? Now, obviously, they're not going to do that. Right? But the wording of the question is really the key. Okay? So it could be it does rhyme, but it's more the wording of the question. Okay, you're really trying to influence their answer. Maybe an example I've seen in the past is like, let's say that the students decide that they want to start wearing hats at school, okay, because they think that this no hat policy is bogus. All right, so they're going to conduct a survey of students to see whether or not you should be able to wear hats. And the administration says that the majority of the students want it, we'll let you wear it. Okay. So what if the survey question said, don't you think Stonewall's hat policy is bogus? Should we be allowed to change it? Is that suffering from response bias? Sure, because you're already giving your opinion in the question. So the question has to be non-influential. Okay? It has to be neutral. Thank you. It has to be neutral. Okay? It has to be non-biased. Okay? Unbiased. Neutral. That would be a response bias. There are three different things. Okay? Sometimes surveys or data collection methods suffer from more than one type. They are three distinct types. Okay? So, knowing the types of bias now, let's go back to questions 11 and 12 and identify the types of bias that are involved. Okay, so we'll look at 11 first, types of bias, and then I'll pause while y'all do that. Okay? All right, let's look at 11. We already know that by putting an ad in the paper, it's really not a sampling method because you're asking people to respond to the ad. So really, it's suffering from what? Voluntary response bias. Okay? So I agree. So voluntary response bias. Okay, good. Part B says one of the elementary schools in contact every parent by phone. What do you think about this one? Non-response is that if you contact every parent, then it's not non-response because every person had an equally likely chance to respond, right? So it's also a voluntary response because if you're calling them by phone, can't they just hang up? Okay, so that's the same kind of response bias. Okay, I see what you're saying. In a cluster sample, we are to assume that all of the subsets, all of the strata are already included. So there's not one group that's not represented. So we're talking about, like, for example, if we're doing elementary school, all the first, second, third, fourth graders are all represented. It's just they're just from a different school. So when you're thinking about a cluster sample, all of the stratas are inside of it. So it would never suffer from non-response because they're in that, all the groups are there. Okay? All right, let's look at C. Send a survey home with every student and ask her to fill it out. You can choose to participate or you can choose not to participate. This is still voluntary response bias. Okay? It will probably suffer from non-response bias here because but everyone's going to bring it back, which means that there will likely be groups of subgroups that won't be represented in the sample. We can't say guarantee, because maybe there will be, but it will likely suffer from that. Yes? And honestly, they almost always suffer. Almost all of them suffer from undercoverage, so we should probably include that in every one. Undercoverage is just when it's not representative, right? So any sample that's not representative suffers from undercoverage. Okay? All right, so we said C will involuntary response will most likely suffer from response bias, non-response bias, because likely there will be whole groups of people that won't respond, and definitely under coverage as well. All right, let's look at D. D says, oh, that's the stratified sample, right? So what do you think about D?
One under coverage and then two.
Possibly under coverage, but it does say that they're going to follow up, doesn't it?
So response.
I don't think it's biased at all. Okay? Stratified random sampling and simple random sampling are two of the best methods of sampling that exist, and often do not suffer from bias. Okay? So you have to look hard. In number 11D, it does say that they send them a survey and follow up with a phone call. So we're almost kind of like not letting them get by, right? So we're not letting them not respond. I can't guarantee that it is bias-free. You could make an argument and say parents can choose whether or not to respond to the survey. Parents can choose whether to hang up on you. So I would accept an answer of voluntary response bias with that explanation under it. Okay, that would be fine. But most simple random samples and most stratified random samples are usually bias-free. Okay? All right, let's look at 12. So in 12, it's very similar. In part A, we have a poll on the TV news, and you're asking people to call in. Asking people to call in. Voluntary response bias. That's definitely voluntary response. Okay? Because when you describe, it's not really, if your sampling method is relying on the response that you put voluntary. So it's not really the book calls it a voluntary response sample. Okay? I've never really heard that before until I got this book. Oh, was it? Because it's proper book. Which I'm fine with. It's just not something that I know. It's a type of bias. B. B says hold a PTA meeting at each of the 20 elementary schools and tally the opinion expressed by those who attend the meeting. If you have an opinion, a very strong opinion, one way or the other, are you likely to attend the meeting? Yes. Okay? Think about the new high school that's coming out and the boundary issues that's associated with that new high school. You're late to the party for the new high school because we got high school over by my house. Oh yeah, over there. Okay. Down 234. It's near the dump. Because we're growing. I mean, this school has 2,400 students in it. We're designed to have less than 2,000. Right. So my point is that is a big issue. That is a very volatile issue with lots of people with very strong opinions. Right. Osborne Park's involved in the high school. That's why the whole boundary issue is why I'm involved with it. But I'm not involved, but I know about it. So that would be, if you're very opinionated one way or the other, you're going to go to that meeting. So if you have a strong opinion, you're not happy with your service at your table, what kind of bias is that? It's voluntary response bias. All right, part C. C says randomly select one class to the multi-stage one. One class at each elementary school and contact each of those parents. If every parent responds, there's no bias. What's the likelihood of that? Probably not, right? So almost never. So you know, you have to rely on people responding to something to you, so most likely that's going to be voluntary again, right? Which kind of bias have we not seen yet? A response bias. What would be an example? I don't think D is a response bias here. Let me just check. Spell D, go through the districts every 4 years. Yeah, no, that's not response bias either. What would be an example of a response bias? Let's think about the new high school boundaries, which y'all are unfamiliar with that. Okay? They're trying to take students away from Britsville, from OP, and one other one. Hang on. There's another one. Another one over there. And I think that it's I probably should be on a test or a quiz, which you'll have eventually on this particular situation. Now you're going to have a test on all of data collection, right? There's a section on the test where I'm going to ask you to identify the types of bias. One of the things might be where I have a survey written out, and you're going to look at the wording, and you're going to correct the wording so that it does no longer has that kind of bias. Okay? So really the wording of the question is the key one. All right, good question. All right, so, this is cute. All right, so, I'm going to assign your homework here in just a second, but if you see, oh, I'm sorry. Stratified sampling is going to be, again, if everybody responds, we're good. I mean, it's not going to be. Wait, I'm thinking the wrong thing. Sorry. Yeah, as long as you stratify, as long as you randomize the starting point of your systematic sampling. Okay? There's no bias if there is a randomized starting point and everybody responds. Okay? So, I love Calvin and Hobbes. I'm sad that it's no longer in the paper. Yeah, my kids don't read it. So I saw this and I thought it was cute. What kind of bias is going on here? Yes, you have to read it. Are you going to read it? You want me to read it to you? Yeah. All right, I'll pretend to my like little son. Yes, go ahead. You can roll up the shoulder. Just like a little bump. Come on, Sam. All right, here we go. Your goals are in that. That's the majority of household 6-year-olds say you're not living up to their expectations of godliness. What were their expectations? Then you'd be more like automatic for your students. And then he's like, where do the pollsters find these respondents? So, what kind of bias is that? Calvin. Okay. Well, he went and surveyed a whole bunch of people. Okay. Who do you think he responded? Or he asked? Himself, probably, and he was also, as a 6-year-old, who else did he respond back? Kids his age that were convenient for him to sample. His friends, right? Okay. Huh? Yeah, Hobbes, right, you know? So that would probably be a convenient sample, right? All right. Suffers from undercoverage, suffers from, could be voluntary response. Most likely, go ahead, probably going to answer the question, right? No? Convenient sampling is a biased sampling in and of itself. So you can say that as well. All right, last one. Wizard of Id. They still have that one too? No? These are for the book, yeah. Okay. How would you rate the King's job performance? Would you say he's doing a good job, an outstanding job, or a terrific job? And that's response bias, right? You have no choice but to answer that he's awesome. Okay? I think I did the same. So, good. All right, let me go ahead and give you your homework. Obviously, 11 and 12 are part of it. So, in chapter 12, next time I will be looking for the 2 different sets of just checking. Make sure that you do both. You're also going to do, now, I'm going to say problems 1 through 10, be very careful. You only need to do D and E for each of those. They're going to talk about, for each of problems 1 through 10, to identify the population, the parameter of interest, the sampling frame. We're not going to do that. Just tell me what kind of sampling method and what kind of bias. Okay, so just answer those 2 parts for 1 through 10. Kind of like what we did in 11 and 12, right? All right. I want you to do 17. I want you to, sorry. D&E only is what I want you to do. Yes. I want you to do 23. Huh? No. Just D&E. That's why I wrote it right after 1 through 10. Okay? You're fine. I think that's going to be it. Okay? If you look at the directions before problem number 1, it says to do A through E for each 1 through 10. I only want you to do D and E. Okay?